All righty, welcome folks. We are going to let folks hop on in and then we will get started. All right, well, I know we have a ton to cover and we've still got folks trickling in, but we're just going to get things kicked off, all right? And folks can catch up if they need to. I expect that you are joining us tonight to hear from our issue experts, of course, but unfortunately for you, first you got to hear from me. So sorry about your luck. I'm Emma Schmidt, and I am the director of the Pipeline Fighters Hub with Bold Alliance. Tonight's webinar is being put on by some of the absolute best organizations this side of the Mississippi, as far as I'm concerned. Frankly, probably both sides of the Mississippi, if we're being honest. So I just want to take a moment to thank the Science and Environmental Health Network, the Illinois Coalition to Stop CO2 Pipelines, Dakota Rural Action, Dakota Resource Council, Food and Water Watch, CURE, and the Iowa chapter of the Sierra Club. And of course, we have to give a big thank you to tonight's presenters. We've got Bill Caram with the Pipeline Safety Trust and Paul Blackburn with Bold Alliance. I am going to pause for a moment and pretend that I can just hear your raucous applause. Of course. Wonderful. Thank you. I'm sure looking at our presenters of tonight, Bill and Paul, you're just thinking there is absolutely no way that those Ken dolls can have the beauty and the brains. But I am here to let you know that they are better than us, and they are indeed the beauty and the brains steering this ship. So I hope you have your pencils and your notebooks ready, because I will give you the money back guarantee that you are going to learn something from them tonight. And at any point, of course, if you have a question, please go ahead and ask, right? There's a couple different ways that you can ask your questions, and we'll be sure to answer them all at the end if we can. But you can, if you're using your computer, go ahead and there's a button at the bottom of your screen that says Q&A. Click it, type your question in there, and we will get to it at the end. If you don't want to go about that method, you can select the button that says chat at the bottom of your screen and pop your questions in there, and we will see them. And then finally, if you are calling in from your phone, you can go ahead and shoot me a text message at 712-830-3748 with any questions. Fortunately, you all had your pencils and your notebooks ready, I hope, so you were able to write down that phone number, right? If not, one more time, if you want to text any questions you have, the number is 712-830-3748. And then now, the last thing before I quit running my mouth, at least temporarily, there are a few instructions. So I just want to make sure that everybody hears this. The rules that we'll be hearing about tonight have not been finalized. And as I'm sure Paul and Bill are going to go into, in accordance with the most recent executive order, all rulemaking from the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, or PHMSA, has been withdrawn and is currently under review. So PHMSA did tell us earlier today that they intend to advance the administration's regulatory priorities for pipeline safety as quickly as possible. But what the administration's regulatory priorities are regarding pipeline safety is, in a way, up to you, all of you out there tonight, right? It's just incredibly important that you advocate to enact CO2 pipeline safety rules. Our leaders need to be hearing from us about this issue. Otherwise, nothing's going to change. Now, you might be wondering, who do I mean by leaders? Well, sure, you can write to your state legislators and your county commissioners. I'm not entirely sure how helpful that would be, but far be it from me to boss you around. But if we can also aim just a little bit higher, right? You can urge your members of Congress to use their power to pressure action on this issue. You can write to the Department of Transportation. I actually saw that Sean Duffy was just confirmed as the new DOT secretary earlier today. And I am frankly just positive he would love nothing more than to receive a congratulatory card from you, especially if it mentions the need to enact CO2 pipeline rules. But you don't need to stop there. If we can take this all the way to the top, right? Contact the White House. Let President Trump know that across the country, our communities, our land, our rights, our lives, our futures, everything is being threatened by risky carbon pipelines. And the very least, absolute very least thing that can be done is to implement what are some common sense safety measures. And with that, I want to go ahead and let us hear from tonight's speakers because they might actually have some good stuff to say. So if you don't already know, Bill Caram is the director of the Pipeline Safety Trust. Bill has a lot of other stuff going for him too, and not just his charm and his charisma, of course. Bill has been involved in a number of important roles within the realm of pipeline safety. So that includes with the U.S. Department of Transportation's Hazardous Liquid Pipeline Advisory Committee, which is a mouthful to say, and the Washington's Citizen Committee on Pipeline Safety. He's testified before Congress, and his unmatched, absolutely unmatched insight has been sought by everyone from lawmakers to national press, and of course by us here tonight, right? I didn't actually clear this part with Bill, but if you want an autographed headshot from him, don't be afraid to ask. I'm sure he will deliver it. Then we will also be hearing from Paul Blackburn. Paul is an attorney and a policy advisor with Bold Alliance. And while his youthful glow might fool you into believing he just graduated high school, he has actually been involved in pipeline issues since 2008, I believe. He's represented clients in agency proceedings in South Dakota for the Keystone XL pipeline and in Minnesota for Line 67. Paul has also drafted model ordinances for communities looking to enact protections against CO2 pipelines. He's provided countless memos and analyses on various laws and policies. And if you haven't checked out his writings over on pipelinefightershub.org, what are you even doing with your life? But what I'm getting at really is that these two fellas here, they know a thing or two about a thing or two, but you don't have to take my word for it. I will let them show you. So go ahead, take it away, Paul. Teach us everything you know.
Maybe. Thanks, Emma. Welcome to everybody who's here tonight. We've got a little over 200 people online now, so we're doing very well, and that's great to see that much interest in this issue. I'm sure the Pipeline Safety Trust is very happy about that as well. And the way this is going to work is I'm going to walk through a presentation, and it's going to essentially give us an opportunity to describe what the proposed rule says. Now, we're not going to be providing suggested comments tonight because it's a bit soon for that, and we're not exactly sure the timing of the proposed rule, of what happens to this rule. But I think it's still important to go through and see what's been proposed so you understand how you can advocate for the rule to be released by the Trump administration. And the way it's going to work is I'm going to go through and move the slide, and then Bill will provide comments on different issues, and I'll do the same thing after we go through the slide. And hopefully between the two of us, we'll have enough knowledge to be able to explain it adequately and to provide you the information that you might need, and answer any questions afterwards. So let's see. Well, I'll share my presentation now. It'll take me just a second to set this up. Just a second.
It could take all night. We don't mind. Just looking at both of your beautiful faces is fine by us.
Well, Paul's bringing that up. I'll just say a few words. Thanks for the great introduction, Jess. I'm sorry, Emma. Overall, while Paul's putting this together, I think the message that I'm hoping comes across tonight is that PHMSA really has put forth a relatively strong proposal. If it were finalized as is, would it make CO2 pipelines completely safe? Absolutely not. There's an inherent danger to them, but it would do a good job modernizing the regulations. But there is a long process from here. It hasn't even officially been published as a proposal, let alone become a final rule. And there's many steps between. All of those historically have weakened what has been part of the proposal. So we have a long road ahead of us, and I'm hoping that Paul and I can demonstrate what's good about a lot of what's in there, maybe some ways it could be improved as well. so that you are all strong advocates to make sure that this rule gets across the finish line eventually, as intact as it can be and as strong as it can be.
There, can everybody now see the presentation first slide?
Yep.
Great, sorry about that. So I'm calling this a stroll through the proposed CO2 pipeline safety rule, and you know, it's pretty long. It's 346 pages long, and so put on your walking shoes, sit back, relax, get something to drink, and this is going to take a little while. We've got about 2 hours scheduled for tonight if you want to stick around that long. But there's a lot of material here to cover, so just be aware that, you know, it's going to take a little while to move through this, but we'll go through it as efficiently as we can. So yeah, this is, I think Bill was just talking about this, you know, the January 15th PHMSA proposed the CO2 pipeline rule, and interestingly, it includes requirements not only for CO2 pipeline, but also for hazardous liquid pipelines. They expanded a variety of the rules, a lot of rules to cover a much broader set of pipelines, which is also good for people who are near hazardous liquid pipelines. And if you want to see the rule, I've got a link down there, and I think I can post it in, no, somebody else can post the link in the chat so that everybody can get the rule, because it used to be posted at PHMSA's website, but the Trump administration took it down. So if we can get that posted on the chat, that'd be great. Let's see. So I think Bill just talked about this. Is there anything else you want to say about the Trump hold?
No, not right now, Paul.
Okay, yeah, I mean, my thought about that is this rule is not dead yet. You know, it can be brought back by the Trump administration. There's nothing stopping them from doing that. I mean, they're going to want to take a look at it through the White House and the Office of Management Budget and the political appointees who want to see it. But, you know, it could bring the rule back. And I think the Trump administration should be pressured to do that. Now, the rule addresses, as I break it out, 22 significant areas of CO2 pipeline safety improvements. But it also includes lots of administrative and what are called conforming technical changes. But we're not going to go through every last little detailed technical change, because they're important in their own way, but they're not relevant to go through here. So let's go do section by section now. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the jurisdictional limits at capture, sequestration, and use facilities. PHMSA does not have jurisdiction over anything except for pipelines used in transportation. That means that it doesn't control and regulate facilities where products are captured, where products are made, where products are stored or sequestered, or enhanced oil recovery operations. So the question is, where's the boundary between what PHMSA regulates and what PHMSA does not regulate? And there were some gaps because of the prior rule that didn't contemplate storage of products, long-term storage of products. So PHMSA modified its jurisdictional rules to ensure, to define where its jurisdiction ends. And so, you know, you can just see in the slides here, there's some very specific rules. And PHMSA noted that for sequestration sites and enhanced oil recovery operations, that those are regulated by the US EPA through its underground injection control program. And I just thought it'd be useful for people to know that PHMSA doesn't deal with things at the beginning and at the end of pipelines. It deals with the things that pipelines go from and to, for the most part. Let's see, any comments on that, Bill? And then the next big thing is the definition of carbon dioxide. As I think you all knew, carbon dioxide was defined as just supercritical fluids in the stream as 50% or more carbon dioxide molecules. Or sorry, that was 90% or more. And that limited jurisdiction of PHMSA because it didn't include liquid carbon dioxide. And there was potential that pipeline companies would try to ship CO2 at quantities just below 90% so they could avoid jurisdiction. So this amendment, I think, allows PHMSA to regulate, you know, it says gas, liquid, or supercritical phases for any stream that has more than 50% CO2 in it. So that should cover all CO2 pipelines. Any other thoughts on that, Bill? Or
No, I did think it was strange that they still kept the word fluid as a description. I think by listing out gas, liquid, and supercritical, that helps a lot. It's interesting they really did want some percentage in here because they didn't want a trace amount of carbon dioxide in, say, a natural gas pipeline to then be somehow categorized as a carbon dioxide pipeline, and so that's why they have a percentage and they settled at 50%.
Yep. Okay, let's see. And again, we're going to take questions at the end. So if you have any questions, put them in chat, send them to Emma, or write them down on a piece of paper. So the next piece is that they included carbon dioxide as a highly volatile liquid. And this is something that I wasn't expecting them to do, but it actually, I think, is relatively useful because highly volatile liquids are things like propane and gasoline and whatnot that form a vapor cloud when they're released. And there are special safety rules related to highly volatile liquids. Now, CO2 pipelines don't explode in fireballs like these other pipelines, but they do create plumes upon release. And so they are a highly volatile liquid. And because of that, by including them in highly volatile liquid category, it means that there's special rules on valve spacing. For example, I believe it's 7.5 miles for highly volatile liquids near high consequence areas for valve spacing. There's pressure testing requirements, special emergency planning, notification procedures, and pipe movement testing, overpressure safety devices, and protection system testing and integrity management requirements. So it was sort of a nice thing to see them do this. What do you think, Bill?
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's also, originally the highly volatile liquid category, CO2 was kind of lumped with it, but kept separate. And I think it was because there was this sense that it wasn't nearly as dangerous as HVLs. And by now fully categorizing them as another HVL, I think that's PHMSA acknowledgement that these really are just as dangerous as explosive HVLs, which is important.
But one thing before I move on, I want to notice that at the bottom of each slide, I have the page numbers for in the proposed rules where they discuss each of these issues in case people want to play along. All right. The next thing is expanded reporting for safety-related conditions. This is interesting because in the past, for other pipelines, if a building, an occupied building or place of assembly is closer than 220 yards to the pipeline, then if there's a safety-related condition, the pipeline company is required to report it to PHMSA. But we know that carbon dioxide can affect people much further away than 220 yards. So what the proposed rule does is it requires reporting safety conditions for all highly volatile liquid pipelines, regardless of the distance to any building or assembly place. So they took away the 220-yard limitation. So if that means that if there's occupied buildings or places of assembly between, you'll see later when we talk about this, between further away 220 yards up to 2 miles away from a pipeline, the pipeline operator, if they find a safety-related condition, which is something that's like corrosion or the pipeline's has some serious problems with it, the pipeline operator has to report it to PHMSA, and then presumably PHMSA will track that, and the pipeline operator will make a better effort to take care of it. So this is, I think, a good addition as well. So do you have any thoughts on that one, Bill? Or
yeah, I agree. It's a great addition and one I hadn't thought of, and I'm glad that they did. Safety related conditions, like Paul said, it could be an overpressurization event or finding corrosion, and they're meant to be these leading indicators of a problem on the pipeline that doesn't qualify as an incident or a failure that needs to be reported to PHMSA otherwise, but it's this it's something that would precede a failure, and it's kind of a warning. and Congress told PHMSA, you need to collect information on these safety related conditions without exception. And interestingly, PHMSA decided to put all these exceptions in, even though the law didn't really offer that. I think the more, the better on these collecting this kind of information. And again, I think it's an acknowledgement of the kind of far-reaching danger that PHMSA is recognizing that these pipelines can pose, as opposed to the very small, relatively small potential impact radius around a natural gas pipeline, for example.
Okay, next one. Accident reporting. This is a pretty technical one, but PHMSA requires reporting of accidents from CO2 and other pipelines. And essentially what they did is they required that accidents, that pipeline companies, when they have an accident involving CO2 report, whether it was a gas, liquid, or supercritical form. And also they have to identify the total CO2 releases in each year, accidental releases, as well as estimated system leaks. So that means fugitive leaks from pipelines. So basically they're asking for the companies to inventory and provide reports on the full amount of CO2 that that gets out of their pipelines during the year. Any comments on that one, Bill? It's pretty minor in some ways. So running fractures. So what are running fractures? Well, one of the things that we need to understand is that when a CO2 pipeline ruptures, and it can be caused by any kind of outside force or corrosion or whatever. When it ruptures, there's the potential for the CO2 to decompress so quickly that it tears the pipeline open like a zipper over substantial distances. This is also possible with natural gas pipelines, but it's significantly more possible because of a variety of physical reasons for CO2 pipelines. And the current regulation essentially just says the pipeline operators have to design their pipelines to prevent ductile fractures. And that's all it says. It's like one sentence long. It has no details. It's completely just sort of aspirational in its language. And so what PHMSA did is they went through and they put more specific requirements on more detailed standards on how pipeline companies are required to stop these running fractures. And the primary way that is supposed to happen is by having strong enough pipe. And in that regard, PHMSA adopted the American Petroleum Institute standard for running fractures, which I'm surprised hasn't been adopted. Previously, this is the standard industry practice, and all companies are going to follow it anyway. So it's not clear how much of an addition that will be to the current practices, but at least it's in federal. The requirement to comply with running ductile fracture requirements will be in federal law. And then they also imposed a specific standard, which is that there has to be a 99% probability of fracture arrest within 8 pipeline lengths of 320 feet and a 90% probability of within 5 lengths of 200 feet. But that gives you a sense that PHMSA considers a serious issue, that this still means that even if it complies with the standard, 200 feet of pipeline could be blown up and blow a trench, multiple feet deep and blast that pipe, in all directions like shrapnel. So, this is at least acknowledgement of the significant risks that running ductile fractures can impose. And if that doesn't work, this pipe steel strength, then if it's impossible, the rule says if it's impossible to use to make strong enough pipe, then they can install what are called crack arresters, which are essentially just bands of either metal or composites like fiberglass around the pipe that adds an additional bit of strength and will stop the fracture from running down the pipeline. So anyway, any thoughts on that one, Bill?
No, I agree that this is just a common sense following an industry standard, and it's should have been in the regulations a long time ago.
Okay. Another one that's also sort of common sense, and this is that there's a new amendment to the valve rule, and that's to require that carbon dioxide in all valves and hazardous liquid pipeline systems be designed so that they can handle all the constituents and contaminants in the product stream. Carbon dioxide pipeline is going to have a lot of contaminants. They also, as we know, if they have water in them, will be more corrosive. There can be cryogenic effects and other kinds of ways that carbon dioxide pipeline affect equipment differently than petroleum or other hazardous liquid pipelines. And this rule just essentially requires that they design valves that can handle the product they move through. And it's sort of surprising again that PHMSA doesn't have that rule in law already, because it would seem to be like the industry knows they have to do that. And if they fail to do that, the valves will fail. And maybe that's why some CO2 pipeline valves have failed. For example, the one in the Denbury and Satarsha wasn't able to close, and maybe it was incompatible with the CO2 at some level. Any thoughts on that one, Bill?
No, just shows, how many of the regulations have been written with the assumption that, of course, the industry is going to build it the right way, and they don't get specific enough in the regulations. So glad to see them attempting to modernize them.
Another one is in the same category, computer leak detection systems. These are called computational monitoring, pipeline monitoring programs. And essentially what these are is that, and we all know that pipelines have computer control systems with operators typically a long way away from the pipeline is, and they have communications equipment that allows them to monitor the pipeline equipment and pressures and flows and whatnot. And and most pipelines, probably almost all pipelines now, use that data as a means of determining whether a pipeline has ruptured or is leaking. And there's a variety of ways that they can use the data with computational manipulations to figure out whether the pipeline is leaking. But this rule doesn't apply to all CO2 pipelines. It applies to CO2 pipelines near a high consequence area, but not to all CO2 pipelines. And what this amendment would do is to expand the rule to have computer monitoring for pipeline ruptures or failures for all CO2 pipelines. Anything to add, Bill?
Just that it's there are no standards on leak detection systems in the regulations as to how sensitive a system needs to be, or accurate or reliable. There's been an attempt on the gas side to put those kind of standards for the first time, but that hasn't been finalized, and there are no standards on the liquid side. And this would have been a really good opportunity to do that, and it's disappointing to see they just say you have to have a leak detection system, you have to have a computer leak detection system, but they don't say it needs to be capable of detecting this size of a leak in this amount of time. And certain states have put those kind of requirements in place, so it can be done. There's industry standards about it, and it's disappointing that PHMSA didn't do it here.
Okay, the next one is location-based safety standards, and this is sort of an odd one because this is part of there's conflict over what this rule means in the federal courts right now. What we maintain that the Pipeline Safety Act prohibits PHMSA from determining the location or routing of a pipeline, but they have this rule 49 CFR 195.210 that was first enacted for natural gas pipelines way back in 1968, I believe. And it requires that pipeline operators consider the location of structures and buildings and whatnot when they're locating a pipeline. And it's a very general rule right now, subsection A. But the thing about it is that PHMSA can't enforce that, we don't think, because they can't. The law says that PHMSA can't prescribe the location. So if a pipeline operator failed to consider where structures were, PHMSA couldn't sue them in court and force them to do that, because PHMSA would then be prescribing the location of a pipeline. But PHMSA at least made some useful comments here. They said they want to enhance the location-based safety standards that apply, quote, following a pipeline operator's decision-making regarding the location of the facilities, unquote. So once a pipeline operator has located its facilities, and that actually can be a regulatory requirement by a state or county government can tell them where they're going to put their pipeline. So this language is a little bit wrong. It should say following a pipeline operators or regulatory agencies decision-making regarding location of facilities. That was, I think, something that PHMSA just missed. That the truth is that it isn't just pipeline operators that just make decision-making about location of pipelines. So anyway, and what they've decided to do is that this sorry about that. So PHMSA has imposed this 2-mile distance where they have to evaluate whether any occupied residence or building or place of assembly within 2 miles of a pipeline could be threatened, and they have to try to avoid it. And when operators pick a route, they have to retain their route decision-making documents, which is sort of a funny requirement for me because they have to retain their documents if this is after they've built the pipeline. You know, it's not going to change where the route goes ahead of time, and PHMSA can't enforce this rule after the fact anyway. So really, it seems like this requirement that operators must retain the route to make decision-making documents is just a way for pipeline operators to defend themselves in case they route the pipeline poorly, and they can try to defend themselves in court if they get sued over that. I don't really understand why PHMSA put that in there because it seems to be superfluous. But the PHMSA does require that pipeline operators conduct population density surveys to catalog the location and the needs of affected persons and to inform pre-emergency public awareness initiatives and response. So this 2-mile rule is related to the emergency response provisions that we'll talk about later in the presentation. But the rule requires distribution of emergency info, including specific precautions to every occupied building and place of public assembly. And I think that's a good thing for pipeline operators to do. We know in Satarsha that Denbury failed to provide any notice to the folks in Satarsha or the emergency responders. And I think this rule is intended to help make sure that people know that the CO2 pipelines are there and what they have to do in the event of emergency. Any comments on that one, Bill?
I was happy to see the 2-mile on either side corridor here and work its way elsewhere. And I think it helps all of us from this point on point to something and say, you know, PHMSA identified this 2-mile on either side, a 4-mile wide corridor as potentially impacted, you know, gives us all a foothold on something to point to when we're talking about potential risks. And yeah, I think PHMSA realized they clearly don't have any jurisdiction on siting, and they tried to think, what can we do that is within our jurisdiction, and that's where they, you know, this records retention justifying the route they picked was just something they could do, something they could require of operators that would hopefully make them think twice about the way they are choosing to route a pipeline. And I do really like the you know, public awareness built in around that 4-mile wide corridor, 2 miles on either side.
Yep. Okay, next one. Depth of cover. So PHMSA has proposed to increase the depth of cover required in all agricultural lands, I believe for all hazardous liquid pipelines and CO2 pipelines, to 48 inches. But at the same time, they retained a more general requirement that all pipelines be constructed below the level of cultivation. But PHMSA rules don't regulate what level of cultivation means. So this means that there's no other federal definition for level of cultivation. I've looked into that. And so that means there's no official federal definition of what the level of cultivation means. And in the absence of a federal definition, two states, Minnesota and New York, have both imposed standards for the level of cultivation that are greater than 48 inches. I believe Minnesota is 4.5 feet, so that's 54 inches. And I forget what New York's is. It might be 48 inches. But suffice to say that I think it's an improvement for safety to have the pipelines be buried deeper. And at the same time, it also means that the trench is going to be bigger for pipelines and there's going to be a greater impact to the land and to the soils. So there's some trade-offs there. And I think it's still an interesting question that counties and state governments can probably still define what level of cultivation means. And certainly individual landowners can say they cultivate deeper than 48 inches. One of the issues in the Midwest with the Summit Pipeline is related to whether tiling, drainage in fields that can go down quite deep, 8-10 feet, is considered cultivation, and some farmers believe, and some counties have believed that it does. So, 48 inches has, I think, better safety than the normal 30-inch level. But there are some trade-offs with that too. Any thoughts on that one, Bill? Or
Yeah, I think most of the safety benefits I think probably come from the less likely to have excavation damage or things like that. In the case of an actual rupture, it can be so violent that I'm not sure that some extra coverage is going to provide too much more safety. But again, this matches the deepest cover depth of cover requirement they have on any pipeline. So that's good. It's better than it is. The other thing is that they're required to maintain the depth of cover, which is something we've been advocating for all pipelines for a long time as an organization. It's kind of crazy that it's not currently required. There's a lot of river scouring that happens on river crossings, and pipelines become exposed, and just windswept places where pipelines become exposed, and the only requirement is on that depth of cover is at time of construction, and there's no requirement to maintain it. And so it's good to see that there's some requirements on maintaining the depth of cover as well.
yep, and we'll get to that
Oh, sorry, Paul.
in the future. I did it in the same order PHMSA did theirs, and they didn't make it necessarily flow. Leak detection alarm systems at pump, compressor, meter, and valve stations. It requires that all highly volatile liquid pipelines, which with this proposed rule would include carbon dioxide pipelines, install leak detection alarm systems on pump stations, meter stations, valve stations, and compressor stations. And so this means that if there's a leak, there'd be detectors there and alarms that go off, both auditory and visual. So there'd be sirens and flashing lights and things like that. Partially, this is intended to protect workers at these stations, and partially it's intended to protect surrounding communities. Again, it's another one of these rules that just seems, and right now it already, well, the new section, 195-452 I-5 is going to require similar equipment at all existing HVL pipelines facilities that could affect an HCA, and then it also requires that the new rule requires that they do regular or proper maintenance of this detection and emergency alert equipment. Any thoughts on that one, Bill?
It's good to remember that this in the rule is not on the pipeline in its entirety, that it's at the certain pieces of infrastructure. So something like this would not have come into play during Satartia, but it would have come into play the incident that happened at the pig launcher station in Sulphur, Louisiana last April. Now it's only on new and replaced pipelines, so they won't be required to go back to existing infrastructure to put this on. But Summit Pipeline, for example, would, if this rule were finalized as is, would have to put this on all the pump stations and other kind of above ground infrastructure. But if there is a pipeline rupture that's not at that piece of infrastructure, it would not necessarily trigger this alarm system. And so it's not a replacement for odorant or other, alert systems.
And it seemed like this was in response to the sulfur,
Yeah.
sure, where the pipeline, where a pig launcher, I believe leaked, and that affected the local community. But there wasn't any good way to alert people to the fact that this pipeline was leaking CO2 in large amounts. Let's see. Another simple one that PHMSA has proposed to stop allowing carbon dioxide to be used as a pressure test medium. So when pipelines are new, or when they're being inspected, because there's a consideration that they might have weaknesses in them, federal rules require that the pipeline company fill their pipeline with some substance. It can be different substances, but typically it's water, and pump the pressure up to high pressure, and it's called a hydro test. And in the past, CO2 pipeline companies could just use CO2 to conduct their tests. And PHMSA has now, the proposed rule would prohibit them from using CO2, and the basic idea that, if they're going to be testing a pipeline to see whether it ruptures, because there's a possibility it could, using a material that's dangerous like carbon dioxide to test it just doesn't make sense. So essentially, the practical result of this is that they're going to require that CO2 pipeline companies pressure test their pipelines with water and not with carbon dioxide. Any thoughts on that one, Bill? It's pretty basic. It makes sense. Spike pressure testing. As part of this hydro testing, it's possible to run, they typically have to run the pressure up to 125% of the maximum operating pressure, which is roughly the same as the sustained maximum yield of the pipeline, meaning the point at which it might start being damaged. But they also can, for short times, run the pressure up to 150% of the maximum operating pressure. And this short high pressure test is called a spike test. And there's only one current reference to it in that kind of testing in current federal regulations. But apparently PHMSA feels like that this is an important new component, should be an important new component of hydro testing, is to do this spike pressure testing. Any thoughts on that, Bill?
No, I think this is, we're always happy to see these kind of test requirements. It's a really irreplaceable way to just ensure the integrity of a pipeline.
Geohazard prevention. We all know that the Summit pipeline ruptured because the land slumped, and that's called a geohazard. Geohazards take many forms. But it's anything where the physical changes in the land or water can threaten a pipeline. It could be earthquakes, it could be floods, it could be land subsidence, it could be karst topography, sinkholes, highly erodible lands, and those kinds of geotechnical threats to pipelines. And there aren't any strong requirements for what they have to do. At present, they basically just fly over a pipeline with an airplane once every couple of weeks and look around and see if anything looks amiss. But that really is what I call World War I technology. Let's take a plane and have some guy with eyes fly over a pipeline and see if they see anything. They've got much more sophisticated equipment now to do pipeline inspections, either from satellites or from drones or from aircraft, including ground penetrating radar and different kinds of other photography based analyses where they can see whether the land is moving or there have been significant changes in the landform. And so PHMSA is proposing to require that the pipeline companies perform more detailed inspections and evaluations, determine the logic and the geologic hazards and impact of the pipeline, and take remedial action. And the last part especially, I think, is important, the taking remedial action, because right now the regulations say you have to go inspect this stuff, but it doesn't say you have to do anything about it if you find a problem. And so, I mean, there are other parts of the rule that arguably would make them take action in response to a geohazard, but having it be expressly included in the rule, I think, is an improvement. And it'd be good for them to force them to use better technology to survey the pipelines and not just do a flyover once every couple of weeks. Thoughts on that, Bill?
Yeah, I think this is a case where for a long time, failures due to geohazards were just kind of considered an act of God. What's an operator to do? And the public has changing expectations on pipeline safety, and that's not acceptable. And the PHMSA regulations have not caught up with that yet. The fact that there really isn't anything in the regulations about it. So, the 2-week having to do a patrol every 2 weeks, they already have to do that. All they're doing is saying, while you're doing those patrols, also look for geohazards. And then, yes, if you see some problem, take remedial action, which is definitely a positive step, a step in the right direction, but they could have done so much more. Paul mentioned some of those tools they could have required. They have inline inspection tools, the smart pigs that track geospatial data. They could have required them to run those over time to track how the pipeline's moving so they could calculate strain. They could have required them to install strain gauges on the pipeline at the time of installation, where they could track that over time. But it is a step in the right direction. It's an improvement.
Hey, inspection and maintenance of depth of cover. And this is, I think, a sleeper issue and something that surprised me. And as Bill already said, back, I think in the 90s, there was a push to try to get the pipeline industry to maintain depth of cover. So we all know they have to build the pipelines below a certain depth, put a certain amount of dirt over the top of pipelines. And there was a push to try to force them to maintain that depth of cover, because we know that there's water and soil erosion, different sorts. Pipelines, when they're empty, can become slightly buoyant relative to saturated land. So pipelines tend to come to the surface in many places over time. And when they come to the surface, they're often in agricultural lands. And if the pipeline is too close to the surface, there's a risk that farming equipment would hit the pipeline and damage the pipeline or the farming equipment or harm the operator of the equipment. And so what happens now is that typically what pipeline companies do when they realize that their pipeline has lost depth of cover and it's getting to be relatively little dirt over the top of it, to the point where the farming equipment could damage the pipeline, they contact the farmer and they say, you need to stop farming over the easement near the pipeline. If you want to keep farming over the pipeline, you have to bring in dirt at your expense and have that added so that you can continue farming. Now, this isn't at all fair, because first off, the farmers didn't really ask for the pipeline to be on their property in the first place. It's not their pipeline, and why should they be required to maintain depth of cover? But that's the practical result. The reason that that's a practical result right now is that PHMSA's rules do not require the pipeline operators maintain the depth of cover and inspect for depth of cover, or when they find that the depth of cover isn't sufficient to remediate it, meaning to add more soil or do something, or, for example, to pay the farmer not to farm in that easement. But as I said, right now, the companies don't have any obligation to maintain depth of cover whatsoever under federal law. But this is also applicable so it's all lands, not only agricultural lands, but other lands, and also water crossings. And we've also seen examples of pipelines where a creek or river has scoured the creek bed, and the pipelines end up being many numbers of feet over the top of the stream, hanging in midair across an eroded water body. Now, there were some in Minnesota on Enbridge's system that were like that for years, And it isn't safe because if there's floods, you get tree stumps and whole trees coming down through these creeks, slamming into the pipeline. You know, this is not a safe operation. But again, the companies aren't necessarily required to do anything about depth of cover. So originally they had to be a certain amount of distance under the creek bed, but now it's up in the air. You know, this change would require that they deal with that situation. So anyway, that's, what do you think of that one, Bill?
Yeah, like I said before, when I jumped the gun, I was really pleased to see this, and it's something we've been advocating for a long time, and would like to see it spread over to gas pipelines too.
Yeah, and I think, you know, this is potentially one that would cause the industry a lot of heartburn, because it potentially imposes a great deal of liability on pipeline companies, because there's lots of mileage of pipeline around the country that doesn't have adequate depth of cover over it. And the pipeline industry doesn't want to pay to maintain depth of cover. They want to impose that liability on the landowners whose land it's on. So this rule could in effect substantially change the pipeline company liabilities and responsibilities and the cost of operations. And so I expect the pipeline companies will be opposing this, but on the other hand, I think it's a really good significant benefit to pipeline landowners in the United States. Probably most of whom have no idea that this situation exists until a pipeline company calls them up and says, you know, you have to stop farming your land or your whatever other activity that they were not going to let you do because the pipeline is near the surface. Let's see, next one, conversion to service. So when natural gas pipelines can be taken out of natural gas service and then converted to carbon dioxide transportation service. And this has been proposed by the Trailblazer project that goes from Nebraska to Wyoming. And then we believe there are a number of other projects proposed like this down the Gulf Coast. But when you convert a natural gas pipeline to carbon dioxide service, it may or may not be designed, it really isn't going to be designed to move carbon dioxide. And the question is that pipeline, is it appropriate to use that pipeline? And if it is as is, and if it isn't, what do they have to do to change it? So these are some of the specific rules related to conversion of service. If the pipeline company wants to convert a non-hazardous liquid pipeline to hazardous liquid or carbon dioxide pipeline service, it has to take a number of actions. And what do you guys think of this, Bill?
Yeah, this I think they did a good job here. Again, it's crazy that this wasn't already in the regulations, not just for CO2, but there's conversion of service between other products, and we have a PHMSA advisory bulletin is all we have that just isn't binding, it's just kind of offering guidance to companies on how they do this. And so to have some set hard standards in place is a great step, and I think they did a good job in what those standards are. The spike hydro test is a great way to just prove integrity of the pipeline before it goes into service, and the inline inspection within 12 months, and then the other pieces I think all work together um, um, for conversion to service. Now, I don't think, I certainly hope we will not be seeing conversion to service of dense phase CO2, that we're really going to be seeing more of like the Trailblazer project where they're converting some sort of natural gas or oil or refined product pipeline to gas CO2 service because of the pressure requirements of dense phase CO2. And so we're going to have a much less dense product in those pipes, which is of course still dangerous, but it does pose less safety risk than the dense phase. And so I think they did a good job here, and I hope this stays in.
Yeah, and of course, it's in addition to the pipe strength issues, there's also, all the other equipment that if it's designed to handle natural gas, it may not be able to, or oil, it may not be able to handle carbon dioxide and the temperature changes and the different kind of corrosive effects and liquid and supercritical CO2 are both good solvents. So the kinds of plastics and seals and other kinds of materials used to seal pipelines all have to be adequate for use of CO2 with CO2 pipelines. And there's just a lot of other equipment in pipelines that has to be adjusted, or it has to make sure that it's suitable for use in CO2 pipelines. And it's not an easy thing for the companies to do. There's lots and lots and lots of parts that need to be checked.
Yeah, not just the solubility, but also the rapid temperature drop from the pressure drop that comes with a rupture from a dense phase too. A lot of materials aren't able to withstand that.
Yep. All right, let's see. Support for local emergency response agencies. This is one that I was happy to see, because essentially what PHMSA is saying is that in the past the current rule right now requires the pipeline companies, communicate with local emergency responders and tell them about the pipeline and do basic training. But that's all they really have to do. And what PHMSA is proposing to do here is to require the pipeline operators actually provide local emergency response agencies with equipment, instruments, tools, and materials, and with training to use all that equipment. So that equipment could be things like the scuba gear, and fire-resistant clothing, detection and monitoring equipment, cleanup materials, all the other things, the list here. And, for small rural fire departments, I think this could be a huge benefit to them, because, in big cities, they're going to have hazardous materials response teams. They're going to have a lot of sophisticated equipment. But in rural areas and small towns and cities, they're going to have maybe a regional team, but it's going to be a long ways away. And so and at the same time, all this kind of equipment is quite expensive. So this would open the door to local emergency response agencies going to pipeline companies and saying, here's what we need. Please, you have to, under federal law, you now have to provide this to us. And that, I think, would, like I said, would be a significant benefit to local emergency response agencies. Because, again, the pipeline company would have to talk to those agencies, presumably, figure out what they need, and then provide them with what they ask for. And there may be some negotiations there, but still, compared to right now, where the pipeline companies can impose a lot of risks on communities, on emergency responders, but not have to pay for any of the equipment to keep them safe, or provide training on that particular kind of equipment. Anything else, Bill?
I would say one thing, I agree how great that was in there. I think one way to strengthen it, they talked about equipment in the narrative of the proposed rule, but it's not actually in the language of the code. And if we fast forward a few however many years, and a new CO2 pipeline is being proposed, they're not going to go back and look at the narrative written about the rule. They're going to look at what's in the code. And so specifically saying personal safety devices like breathing apparatuses and all these other things that they listed, I would like to see that in the code itself, so that operators know this is what's expected of them.
Mm-hmm. And then there's requirements to improve company emergency response capacities. And there's a whole variety of things. I mean, one of the things that the rule does is it includes asphyxiation as a risk of pipelines. Now, right now, there's a certain set of risks of pipelines, explosions and fires and whatnot. But asphyxiation is not included as a recognized risk of pipeline ruptures. But we know that that's a risk when CO2 pipelines rupture. So PHMSA is proposing to include asphyxiation as a official pipeline risk. And that triggers off different kinds of requirements throughout the regulations for companies to then teach their employees about asphyxiation, to have equipment to protect them from asphyxiation, and also to describe and explain the risk of asphyxiation to local communities and emergency responders. So, all the places where pipeline companies would say, oh, CO2 is not dangerous. It's just like the soda pop in the CO2, the fizz in your soda. This puts that to bed. I mean, that was always, basically a lie that CO2 at high pressure in a big pipeline is very dangerous and it can asphyxiate people. And this proposed rule would acknowledge that risk and require that companies deal with the reality of potential for asphyxiation of people and animals near pipeline rupture, CO2 pipeline ruptures. It also requires that CO2 pipeline companies have equipment to assess the extent of a vapor cloud, which is not something they're required to do right now. They may have contractors that would do that, but like in Satarsha, the contractors showed up 3 hours after the rupture happened, and by the time I got there, the people had all been pulled out, and it really didn't matter except for sort of a little bit of post-event testing. And then it also requires that there be more company equipment on site to detect harmful concentrations of gas, and so that more company personnel are going to need to have this CO2 detection equipment, not just their contractors from far away, as well as fire control equipment. So, anything on that one, Bill?
Nope, I think you covered it well. Yeah, happy to see it.
Mm-hmm. And then emergency communications, this is another one I was happy to see, because essentially what they're going to require is that companies set up emergency alert systems to alert not only local emergency response agencies, but also the public around pipeline ruptures. And that's not required right now, but we know, for example, that the Source Valley CO2 pipeline in North Dakota has said in the emergency response plan that they have a text and cell phone alert system that they say can alert everybody near the pipeline within 1 minute of the alert being triggered. And this is it depends how fast the pipeline company reacts, but this essentially would be setting up emergency alert systems. And my understanding is that these systems are relatively expensive, and I think one of the questions that would be raised in response to this is who's going to pay for it. Because, local rural counties often don't have the resources to set up these emergency alert systems. And if, in some areas they exist, Amber Alerts and whatnot, but in a lot of rural areas they don't exist. And the question here would be, the good thing about the rules that it appears to require that companies help set up these systems, or actually set up these emergency alert systems. And that would be, I think, a benefit to communities near the pipelines. Anything about that?
Yeah, I think this is great, and it's something that we were hoping to see. And I think this is PHMSA's recognition that emergency response looks different for CO2 than for, say, natural gas. Natural gas, the danger is a explosion that would be very close to the pipeline, and it's basically run to cover as fast as you can. And it's a lot more nuanced with CO2. In some cases, you don't necessarily know which direction the plume is going to go. In some cases, it might make sense to shelter in place. In others, you want to flee in a certain direction. And having this, reverse 911 system, or whatever we're going to call it, that can customize emergency response instructions to groups of people, I think is necessary.
Yeah, I mean, ideally, people who are near the pipeline, and especially very near the pipeline, should know what the risks are and have evacuation plans, or understand if they're a bit further away that the shelter in place would be reasonable. And there's ways of determining which would be best. Local folks should have an emergency plan in the event of a rupture, but in order to implement it, they need to be told, they need to be alerted that there was a pipeline rupture. And, all the equipment and all the technology is there to help people understand this. But right now, there's no requirement by PHMSA that companies do anything other than a very general kind of, there's a pipeline here, and there could be some problems, but there's a lot of gaps in the current requirements related to community alert notifications and emergency response preparation by communities. Let's see, we're almost done here. Plume modeling. Right now, PHMSA doesn't require that there be any particular kind of plume modeling, or that plume modeling even happen. And this rule is a little bit disappointing in some ways. It does require plume modeling, sort of, it allows, it doesn't require computational fluid dynamic modeling. It allows other kinds of modeling combined with what is called overland flow models, which is essentially taking a model that's designed to determine where crude oil goes and then jack it for use in trying to estimate where CO2 goes, which, you know, the company in PHMSA say can be useful, but I'm not sure it's been proven to be particularly effective or a good way of doing things. But at least PHMSA is saying that companies must do these dispersion models, these plume models. However, there's an out for them, and that out is that if they just want to assume that the reason they do these models to determine whether any high consequence areas are within or may be affected by the pipeline. And instead of doing models, what the companies can do is just assume that any high consequence area within 2 miles of the pipeline, it could be affected. And by using that 2 mile assumption, they can avoid having to do dispersion modeling altogether. So I mean, it's okay they did that, but on the other hand, it's hard to say how much companies are really going to use dispersion modeling or plume modeling instead of just taking the 2 mile assumption. So any thoughts on this one, Bill?
You know, the first thing I thought as I read it was great, there's something instead of nothing. But I know both you and I, Paul, have seen lots of awful plume dispersion models that would have checked all these boxes. So there are improvements to be made. We'll have to think about how best to do that. Also, it was a lot to ask of an tentative agency like PHMSA, but I really wish that the plume dispersion models would be made public. I think people around the pipeline have a right to know, and it would be great to see that required. But I'm not surprised it's not in there, unfortunately.
Let's see, and then contaminant control. This is another one that I think is a good addition. We know that carbon dioxide streams can have various contaminants in them, and those contaminants can be dangerous, like hydrogen sulfide, or they can cause dangers to the pipeline, like either hydrogen sulfide or water, which can cause corrosion. But there's a lot of different kinds of contaminants, and the impacts of all these contaminants have never been formally and thoroughly addressed, besides water and hydrogen sulfide. You know, and even things like the addition of relatively small percentage changes in the composition of a pipeline can result in much larger decompression, explosive forces. So it's not just the contaminants corrosion effect, but it's also the contaminants impact on pipeline operations and the compressive force, the compression explosions that happen in the event of a rupture. But it's good to see that they proposed specific limits for water of 50 parts per million, hydrogen sulfide of 20 parts per million. And just to require that they monitor these contaminants, because right now there's absolutely no requirements in federal law that CO2 pipeline companies monitor for contaminants and control the contamination in their pipelines. So, you know, it's a step in the right direction, I think. What's your thoughts, Bill?
Yeah, this is one of my favorite provisions. I think this really this was an area that gives me you know, the most keeps me up at night thinking about the potential for this. Other types of pipelines have an economic regulator that is regulating the content of what's in the product stream and keeping contaminants out as an economic regulator, making sure that the customers are getting like a good quality. But with CO2, there is no economic regulator, so we have a gap there. And things like water and all these other potential contaminants react with CO2 and create acid, that various acids that are extremely corrosive. And if you get above a certain level of water, for example, and you get standing water in the pipe, there's no amount of integrity management program or speed at getting out that's going to keep that pipeline safe. And So to see specific limits put in is really great, and these are pretty conservative limits, and just requiring them to monitor. They just put the first monitoring requirements on gas pipelines recently, to requiring them to monitor for corrosive constituents, and the industry sued on that, and they won, and so they don't have that anymore. So I'm glad they stayed strong and put it here, and we will have to do everything we can to keep it in.
And emergency flow restricting devices is a fancy name for safety valves, for automatic shutoff valves. And the proposed rule to require carbon dioxide pipeline operators to install these check or remote control valves if it determines that a pipeline segment is needed to protect a high consequence area. So again, this would seem to be like a no-brainer to have emergency shutoff valves that if there's a rupture, just automatically close. But the industry's been resisting that for quite a long time, and this is at least a partial step in the right direction. Your thoughts, Bill?
No, I think this is good. There was something in there that was not widespread enough, so glad to see it in there.
Okay, and that's it. So that's our stroll through the proposed CO2 pipeline rule. And we're happy to answer questions for a while, and hopefully we won't be up all night.
Thank goodness, because there are a lot of them. I have tried to kind of organize the questions that have come in so far into sections, so the ones that are related kind of are all together, but like I said, there's a lot, so hopefully we don't miss any. But let's go ahead and kick it off with, how about if the pipeline in Satartia was designed consistent with what's being proposed in this rule, do you think that would have reduced the impact of the rupture or the severity of it?
Good question. So obviously there's some geohazard pieces in here, and that's what caused the rupture. But the geohazard pieces in here are really, more about like gradual land movement, like seeing it over time. And what we had was this breakaway landslide. And I'm not confident that the geohazard regulations in here would have prevented the rupture from happening. I'm not sure, Paul, if you agree on that.
Yeah, and there's no specific changes in, for example, the pipe steel strength requirements. There wasn't a running fracture there, so that, I mean, if the running fracture requirements were in place, that might have been stronger steel that might have withstand the geotechnical fault, but I'd probably not. I think that what the rule would have done in Satartia differently is that probably Denbury would have had spent somewhat more effort to alert the citizens of Satartia and local emergency response agencies about the risks of the pipeline. Some of the communication requirements in the 2-mile limit, Satartia was almost exactly a mile away from the pipeline rupture. The center of Satartia, probably would have swept Satartia into a, the requirements that Denbury alert emergency responders and the citizens, but, would have helped something somewhat.
That's what I think the biggest thing is, that hopefully under these regulations, they would have identified Satartia, this section of pipeline as potentially impacting Satartia. And they would have taken the integrity of the pipeline and the emergency response preparations more seriously, because they had not identified Satartia as being potentially impacted.
And that's because the dispersion model estimated, probably we did a similar dispersion model to the one they probably used, and estimated that there would only be a risk to people about a half mile away from the rupture site, and it would be a relatively small risk even at a half mile, when in reality we saw people falling over and fainting over a mile away from the pipeline. So they really did lowball their dispersion modeling, and that meant they ignored Satartia. So hopefully this rule would have pushed the company more in the right direction.
So can you talk just a little bit more about modeling? So I know a lot of these questions probably got answered at some point, but we just covered a lot of content, so a refresher might be necessary. But so can, yeah, just talk a little bit more about modeling, like do the rules require them to perform modeling and what kind? And, if not, is there some, or if there's, nothing that's adequate, is there something we should be pushing for in terms of modeling requirements?
My understanding is that the rules require them to assess whether a rupture could affect, is the operative language, a high consequence area, meaning a higher population area. But there's no specific requirements for how they do that. There's no requirements that they use dispersion modeling or plume modeling to determine whether a pipeline could affect a high consequence area. There's no rule that they have to use any modeling right now to determine whether a pipeline could affect people in rural areas. That's not required right now. So technically, right now there's no requirement that pipeline companies do any modeling whatsoever. They can do it if they want to, and companies have begun to do it because they use cheap modeling that may cost a few grand, and so why not? And it provides a little bit of liability cover. But the models they use and the assumptions they put into the models are often, done that they pick models and assumptions that are going to lowball the risk so that they don't have to spend money to go out and educate folks, or that they don't feel that they can not talk to people about the pipeline, and the fewer people know about it, the less concern there's going to be. So the current rules let them really sidestep the risk of ruptures with large numbers of people. But the new rule would, again, sort of require dispersion modeling unless they want to just assume that every HCA within 2 miles is at risk. But for people who aren't at HCAs, it doesn't help them. The new rule doesn't really help them, and the current rule does nothing for them.
Can you actually just give us the definition of an HCA or a high consequence area? A couple of people asked that.
Yeah, that's one of the things that they should have changed, is that the high consequence areas for hazardous liquid pipelines are defined. I don't remember the citation right now, but there's a specific descriptions for different types of high consequence areas, and most of them relate to water pollution, because the rules are really written for oil pipelines and gasoline pipelines and whatnot. And there is one population-based component for the rule, but it isn't particularly good. It's just very general. It's anything it doesn't say what the population has to be. So that gives companies wiggle room as well. But in contrast, the high consequence area rules for natural gas pipelines are quite a bit more specific in terms of different classes of higher population areas with specific densities of population and whatnot. But again, I mean, none of this should give any folks in rural areas any warm fuzzies, because they're not considered high consequences, when in fact they are.
Kind of related, so well, actually totally related. High consequence areas could change over time, right? As communities grow or they shrink. Is there a process to account for that?
What
do you know about that, Bill?
So it's a big thing on the gas side, where it's called class location change. So they look at the amount of people around a pipeline, and the pipeline is assigned a class based on that, class 1 through 4, 1 being the most rural, 4 being basically urban. And as an area around the pipeline changes between class 1 to, say, class 3, an operator has to replace the pipeline with stronger pipe, or go through a series of the equivalent safety measures. We don't have a parallel process to that on the liquid side, again, because they've been thinking more about the risk being to drinking water and not to people. But what it means is that more and more of the pipeline, if more and more of the pipeline is determined to be could affect that high consequence area, it comes into the integrity management program. And what that means is they have to be inspecting it more often with inline inspection tools, and they have repair criteria where when they find certain dents and things like that, they're required to repair them on a different timeline than if it were outside of a high consequence area. I'm sorry for the term high consequence area. Obviously, if there's any person within that could affect area, that is a high consequence area. And so I hate using that term, but it's what it's how PHMSA defines it. And so I use it for clarity, and I hope it doesn't come across saying that all of you in rural areas are not a high consequence, because you obviously are.
Yeah, and I think the new rule by including CO2 pipelines as highly volatile liquids would improve some of the safety requirements near high consequence areas. So I think the new rule would have some effect on how that would play out for CO2 pipelines.
Perfect. Can you kind of go into just a bit more detail on the proposal that CO2 pipeline, if it's coming within 2 miles of a residence, like what do they actually have to do? Does the company actually have to do? I mean,
do you have a sense of that, Bill? I mean,
Well,
there's
they
2
have
miles is in a couple different places in the rule, and it's kind of complicated the way they interact with each other.
Yeah, so one thing they have to do is they have to keep records justifying why they chose the route that they did, that came within 2 miles of any building meant for human occupation. Another thing they have to do is they have to include that in their public awareness program. And so there's a whole section of the code around public awareness where operators must send out mailers to people and make them aware of that the pipeline is there and what risks it poses and what to do in case of emergencies. So that 2 mile corridor on either side, so the 4 mile wide corridor, is quite a large area for that public awareness program to have to do, for them to have to do it. For example, on a gas pipeline, it might only be, a few hundred yards on either side that they have to do that public awareness program.
Yeah, and just to be clear, the 2 miles distance is not a setback. There's no rule, since PHMSA doesn't route pipelines and doesn't locate pipelines. They can still build CO2 pipelines as close as they want to a building. People also think there's this 50-foot setback. There's this 50-foot setback for pipelines, from structures, but the rule there says that if they're closer than 50 feet, they have to provide additional foot of cover over the minimum requirements. So it's actually a depth of cover requirement. I mean, when I was watching the first Keystone Pipeline go through Yankton, South Dakota, they went within 20 feet of people's houses. There's absolutely no rule that says they can't go within 50 feet of a house. There's no federal setbacks. Federal setbacks are not allowed by federal law, and they simply do not exist. That's a talking point of the industry that's simply false. So the 2 mile distance has nothing to do with where the pipeline is routed or how it's routed. Companies are not required to avoid properties by 2 miles. They just, when they pick a route where the route is picked for them by a regulator, then they can just assume that everybody within 2 miles could be affected, and or all high consequence areas in 2 miles could be affected, and provide notice and information to those people.
are there any proposals around how pipelines interact with schools? Like, are schools considered HCAs, or do they have to have like special notification when it comes to emergency response and that sort of thing? Anything?
Yeah, schools are typically considered HCAs, and a lot of these rules are triggered by either occupied structures or places of public assembly, and a school could be considered either of those, not only for the students who are there, but often schools are used for community events and whatnot. And there are there's a requirement for the proposed rule has a requirement for for the companies to take account of the kind of facility that could be affected when they determine the emergency alert systems and the support for emergency planning for those particular facilities. So schools, in theory, the proposed rule passed, companies would have to take account if their pipeline could affect a school, and they would have to work with the school specifically to work on emergency planning. But that doesn't exist right now.
Can you talk a little bit about, since you mentioned earlier that PHMSA is not in charge of siting, can you talk a little bit about who is in charge of siting, why that matters, and kind of related, do you think we should be pushing to see setbacks introduced into this rule, or is there some other mechanism for going about that?
Yeah, well, the Pipeline Safety Act, first off, statutes, which the Pipeline Safety Act is a statute, trumps regulations. So a regulation cannot change what a statute says, and it must abide by what statutes say. The Pipeline Safety Act, Section 60104E, expressly says that PHMSA cannot prescribe the location or route of a pipeline. So PHMSA cannot order a pipeline company to go anywhere. They can't say, move your route here, your pipeline here, move it there. They can't say, keep it away from this place or that place. PHMSA has absolutely no ability to route or locate a pipeline. And instead, who has that authority is, if they want to accept it, is state or county governments, depending on what state law says. But you know, so for example, in Minnesota, in North Dakota, in Iowa, in Illinois, the regulators can route a pipeline. In South Dakota, they don't. The state PUC does not have authority to route pipelines. But in South Dakota and in North Dakota, we think, definitely in South Dakota, counties can then establish zoning rules where pipelines go or don't go. In some states, we're arguing right now that in Iowa, counties also have a right to establish setbacks, and that's on appeal to the 8th Circuit. You know, and so you know, it just depends on the specific state and local government rules. Some states, for example, Kansas, have no state rule whatsoever, and I'm not sure what the situation is in rural counties, but they probably don't have pipeline ordinances either. You know, in Texas and Oklahoma, the companies just have to say where the pipeline is going to go to tell the state regulator where it's going to go, but the state regulator has no authority to tell the pipeline company to move its route, and landowners are just stuck with whatever route the company has. So, you know, like I said, the bottom line is state and local governments do have the legal authority to route pipelines, but many of them don't.
All right. This question we got asked multiple times by many of people. Will first responders be provided with electric vehicles in order to respond in the event of an emergency?
I think the answer there is that if this rule was enacted the way it's written, first responders could go to companies and say they need that. Now, the problem with the way the rule for emergency responders equipment is worded right now is that it kind of assumes that PHMSA knows best in terms of what local emergency responders want. There's no requirement that they, you know, ask first responders what equipment they need, and then they'd be required to provide that equipment. Instead, it's ambiguous right now who decides what equipment first emergency responders need. Again, at the 8th Circuit, we have an appeal at the 8th Circuit in Iowa that is going to look at the issue of whether counties can require a disclosure of certain emergency response information. And that might have an effect on a decision about whether counties can also require the companies provide them with emergency equipment. And my belief is that you know, pipeline emergency response agencies have independent jurisdiction from PHMSA over pipeline emergencies. You know, when a pipeline ruptures, the first people to show up are never the company folks, unless it happens to be at a pump station where there are people located. It's almost always the local sheriffs, police departments are there first, followed by the fire departments, or about the same. Some of the fire departments get there first, but But it's always local responders, and they know their own equipment resources, current equipment resources and equipment needs. They understand all the rules for firefighting and law enforcement. So, you know, they should have the right, I think, to specify the equipment they need, and that equipment could include electric vehicles. You know, so, but again, right now, the rule is, if I was gonna make a comment on it, it would be, one of the comments would be that the rule is ambiguous about who gets to decide what equipment is required. And really, pipeline companies don't know much at all. I mean, they're not emergency response agencies, they're pipeline companies. You know, they don't necessarily know what generally what emergency responders need, and they also don't know what specifically what every volunteer fire department and every municipal and county, you know, emergency response services, and it's not just firefighters and law enforcement, it's also EMS, emergency medical service, you know, folks. They're going to go into the danger zones too with ambulances and whatnot. You know, that there should be a mechanism for resolving what kind of equipment must be provided to the local emergency responders. And PHMSA didn't go into enough, didn't require any process for figuring that out.
All right, I'm going to throw a couple, well, actually, I'm going to throw a couple questions at you after I ask this one that are all kind of related, but it says on your slide that the language says it may include for safety equipment. So is it ultimately left to the pipeline operator's discretion on whether or not they actually do provide safety equipment?
Well, that's where, you know, where Bill said that there's no specific regulatory requirement, proposed rule, meaning regulatory language requiring all that equipment. And that's why I put the word may in there. Because it isn't a requirement that they must provide that equipment. It's just in the description of the rule that, you know, the rule says they have to provide equipment. It doesn't say what particular types, but then in the actual proposed regulatory language, the regulation itself, but in the description of the regulation, they say that equipment could include those things. So Bill is right. I mean, you know, they should, the proposed rule should have included a specific list of the kinds of equipment that should have been provided. Does that answer?
Yeah. Would the support for first responders only apply to existing pipe or to new pipelines, or would it also apply to existing pipelines?
What do you think, Bill?
Yeah, I think it applies to existing. It's design, construction, and initial testing standards are the ones generally that don't apply to existing pipelines. All other standards generally do apply to existing and new and replaced.
Perfect. Will the supplies and the training be upgraded and continued throughout the life of the pipeline, or is it like a one and done sort of deal?
Should be done over the life of the pipeline. There's rules for them to update their emergency response plans, and I think that the proposed rule included requirements, for example, to do surveys of who lives in the area and to do those emergency alert networks, emergency alert systems. And I think that the rule also required that they have regular trainings and provide equipment on an ongoing basis to emergency responders, and regular communications with citizens along the pipeline, or you know, people work and live near the pipeline.
Speaking of, Brad is wondering, why is there special equipment for asphyxiation and things like that when it comes to operators, but not for those living along the pipeline? Is there, you know, is that issue covered somewhere else, or?
No, they don't. They talked a lot about whether equipment was available, like carbon dioxide detectors were available for citizens, and they do make domestic carbon dioxide detectors, but they're generally not made for emergency situations. They're made for determining whether your office has too much CO2 in it because it's closed and you don't have good ventilation. So there's not apparently good emergency carbon dioxide detectors. But there's no requirement that they provide citizens with self-contained breathing apparatus, or, you know, or other kinds of protective equipment.
Awesome. Okay. What is there any sort of backup alert system when it comes to, if there is an incident and actually trying to alert people? Like, what if a rupture damaged cell phone towers and things like that? What happens then?
Everybody dies. No. No, right now, there's no requirement for an emergency alert system whatsoever. And this proposed rule would require that they do it, but there's no specificity about whether there'd be a backup system or not. And, and I frankly don't know enough about how those emergency alert networks or systems are set up, the communication structures are set up. Apparently, it's relatively expensive to set up an emergency alert system. And as I said, the rural counties often don't have the money to do that. So, one of the questions here would be who pays for it. And if the companies had to help pay for it, that might mean that there'd be this knock-on effect that the companies would help pay for the emergency alert systems, even if there's not a lot of backups, so they have something. And that emergency alert system then could be used for other kinds of emergencies for governments to alert people about dangerous weather or fires or whatever. So, having the companies help pay for it could be a real benefit to rural communities.
All right, so gonna switch topics a little bit here. How about we talk about depth of cover? Got a number of questions about that. So does the new proposed rules, how does depth cover, this depth cover frost lines in winter zones? Is 48-inch depth low enough for frost line heaves?
No, the frost line, as I understand it, in places like North Dakota can be 6 or 7 feet down. But I don't think that heaves have a big effect on pipelines because the steel strength is so strong that it can withstand typical pipeline heaves. Have you heard any ruptures caused by pipeline heaves, Bill, from frost heaves?
No, no, there's concern in the tundra in Alaska of that potentially starting to happen, given the changes we're seeing up there, but we haven't seen it actually happen yet. But yeah, my understanding is that the steel is strong enough to withstand what you'd expect on a normal climate freeze and thaw cycle.
Yeah, and my theory, and it's just a theory about why the CO2 pipeline companies are wanting or saying they're going to bury this pipeline deeper, have actually nothing to do with safety. Well, maybe it's partially related to safety, but the other reason for them to put a CO2 pipeline deeper is that the deeper you go on the ground, the cooler that pipeline is. The cooler it is, the denser the CO2 is going to be, and the denser the CO2 is, then the more CO2 you can pump through a pipeline on a daily basis. So the cooler the pipeline, the more CO2 that can be moved through it. And by putting the pipeline cooler, that means that in hot summer weather, the pipeline is not going to get as warm and it'll be able to move more CO2 even in hot weather. So I think it's partially related to safety, but I think it's just a way for them to maximize throughput and to make more money.
All right, that's heartwarming. Love to hear it. Are there any depth requirements in the proposed rules when it comes to crossing under rivers or lakes, railroads, roads? Or what about the distances between like the proximity of one pipeline next to another? That was a lot of questions, sorry.
You want to take a shot at that one, Bill? I know some of the answers, but maybe not all of them, so.
Well, I know on sharing a right of way, there's nothing new in the rule about that. I'm trying to think what's in place.
I think there's rules to like depth under ditches along roads.
Yeah, I was thinking about the spacing between pipelines sharing a right of way, that the last part.
Hmm.
Uh, there are some existing standards. I will say we've been concerned about that, and we've gone back and we have not really been able to find failures of one pipeline that have caused a failure of another pipeline in a right of way. So I think this is an area that needs more research, but it hasn't been a safety issue as far as we can tell yet.
I think,
To
yeah,
the
I think the only example I know is that the Keystone 1 pipeline ran along the Platte pipeline in Missouri, and they had electrical interference, and the Keystone almost ruptured because of electrical interference with another pipeline. But I don't think it's, like you said, Bill, it's not very common. And, yeah, and the depth of cover, I don't think there's any specific rules for depth of cover for, like, horizontal directional drilling when they're going under big rivers or lakes or whatnot. They put a big bore underground and then they just bore a tunnel under the water and then drag the pipe through. I'm sure there are engineering standards for doing that, but I don't think that PHMSA has any particular rules about horizontal directional drilling underwater bodies.
No, it tends to be so deep when they do that because they can. That yeah, I don't. I'm not thinking of any standards.
Yeah, and then if you look at 195.248, if you just put in this a search engine 49 CFR 195.248, there's a table there that lists all of the depth of cover requirements for different places. They differ based on whether it's agricultural land now. If this rule, there's none for agricultural lands right now, but for different kinds of lands, and also it's different whether there's bedrock or not. And if there's rock, they don't have to go as deep. And there's, well, I think, rules for how deep it has to be under roads and things like that. But they don't have any rules for how deep it has to be under, for example, private farm roads, and which can carry a large amount of weight for grain trucks and combines and other heavy equipment. So, the rules are, but anyway, there's specific minimum standards for a variety of different kinds of locations in the existing rule. But there's not one for agricultural land. So right now it defaults to 30 inches. But it still has to be deeper than the level of cultivation, whatever that means.
All right. So can you talk a little bit about when it comes to depth of cover? Right now, is the maintenance of that the landowner's expense, or is that something that's typically specified in an easement, or I guess is it being changed by this proposed rule?
Yeah, at present, there's no express requirement in federal law for companies to be responsible for maintaining a depth of cover, and that's why pipeline companies can come in and tell farmers they have to add more dirt at their own expense or stop farming it. I was contacted a couple of months ago by a farmer in southwestern Iowa where it's relatively hilly, and that's exactly what happened to him. And typically what ends up happening is that the farmers have to retain attorneys and they have some kind of negotiation with the pipeline company over what's going on. But it never really works terribly well when you take on a big pipeline company and there are rafts of attorneys on those kinds of disputes. But right now, the federal law doesn't require any maintenance of depth of cover. And one of the things I think would be a real advantage of this rule is that it did propose to require that pipeline companies remediate for depth of cover, loss of depth of cover, which would mean that they would have a responsibility under federal law to maintain depth of cover, and that would take the responsibility off of landowners. If the federal law says the company has to do it, then it would be very clear that landowners have no obligation to add more dirt or to stop farming. It would be completely on the pipeline companies. If this rule passed, it'd be completely on the pipeline companies to maintain depth of cover. And again, for people with pipelines on their property now, which isn't many people in the summit routes, but other folks, all the pipelines and natural gas pipelines and whatnot, that can be a real big deal if they lose a lot of soil from water or wind erosion or for other reasons. Can be a real imposition of farming to have the right of way be unfarmable.
All right. I think those were all of the depth questions. Let's talk about leak detection. So Rick is saying that oil pipelines claim to be able to detect a 1% loss of product with computers. What percent can computers detect a loss of CO2 given the changes in density due to temperature and pressure changes? Leave it to Rick to ask a question like that.
Do you have any thoughts on that, Bill? If you heard any?
I haven't, I'm certainly, I don't know for sure how CO2 leak detection would differ from other hazardous liquid pipeline leak detection. I have also heard the 1% number, our standard or, minimum quoted by operators. My understanding is that CO2 is similar, that it is that 1%. Um, um, and also, but think about how big 1% can actually be. We're seeing it on the Colonial Pipeline on the East Coast, large diameter gasoline pipeline that moves from the Gulf states up the East Coast. We've seen spills there that fell below that 1% level, and just accumulated over time, to be 2 million gallons of gasoline over time. CO2 poses different risks, and it's a different product, but 1% isn't nothing. And a reminder that there's no requirement that the leak detection system the operator uses has to be capable of detecting down to 1%. There's no minimum standard on how sensitive that equipment they use has to be.
Yeah, I mean, 1% is, or 1.5%, I've seen different figures, is still a lot of product. With oil and gas, like I said, gas pipelines, there can be these relatively small leaks that leak over a long period of time, and they're very hard to detect because the percentage of the volume is very low. It's typically it'd be significantly less than 1%. Looking at, I don't know the numbers on top of my head, but looking at these pipelines, 1% would still be a lot of CO2. The other thing is that the decompression of the CO2 would, I mean, first off, the plume would probably be visible in the daytime because it would turn white and you'd have a lot of CO2 vaporizing. The other thing is that the decompression could, if it would likely eventually make that hole bigger and bigger and bigger. I remember reading about a pinhole leak just in an oil pipeline in northern Alaska. And over the course of a few days before it was discovered, the pressure of the oil alone blasting out that hole at high pressure made the hole significantly bigger just from the abrasion of the oil going through the hole. I don't know if that would happen with CO2, but you probably would get the hole becoming brittle because of because the CO2 would get very cold. When it decompresses, it goes down about to minus 50. And so I don't know that a CO2 pipeline could leak at a 1 or 2% level for very long without people knowing it's happening. The pipeline company operators probably wouldn't be able to tell, but everybody around it would probably see, this cloud coming out of the ground and this high pressure gas blasting out of a crater, is my guess, but that's just a guess. So, I think another question is, what about fugitive leaks and smaller amounts of leaks? So like we all know natural gas pipelines leak in small amounts, as do the distribution systems of natural gas pipelines. That presumably would happen with CO2 pipelines, where they would leak small amounts of CO2 because CO2 is a smaller molecule than methane. So I assume that the fugitive leak rate from CO2 pipelines would be greater than what it would be from a methane pipeline, but I'm not sure there's been any studies of that.
Earthworks has some videos on their YouTube channel, I want to say, where they, took one of those special cameras that can show carbon dioxide, and they filmed some existing infrastructure, and they found leaks for sure. So definitely check that out if you're interested. So did you answer that there isn't actually like a standard for when, how little amount the leak would be alerted? You'd be alerted to a leak. Wow, words, that was tough. I guess what I want to ask is, what is the rate at which like a leak would cause an alarm if there isn't a like minimal amount that has been set, a minimal standard? Do we know?
Depends on the system the operator chooses to use, and they have complete discretion over what that system is and what that alarm level is. It's not in this proposal at all, which is a disappointment.
Yeah, it's usually a combination of time and amount. So, if it's a relatively larger amount, like 5%, their systems would probably catch it at 10% just because of the changes in pressure and the amount of product moving past different valves and metering stations and whatnot. But it would still take them a while to figure out if there's a 5% leak. I don't know how long. 1% leak, they, at least in oil pipelines, they can figure it out, but it's through mass balance equations, and it might take them weeks to figure out that they're losing product. And they wouldn't know where, but they would know they're losing it. On the other hand, if they had a rusher that released 25%, they could probably figure that out very, very quickly. So it depends on how much it's coming out and the time over which it comes out. But as Bill said, there's no specific requirements for them to have any there's no particular standards for the specifications for these leak detection systems. It's like, do what you can, and
Of course. What about, leak detection that's not at a valve site, but like, the areas that are actually along the pipeline? What's going on there? Are there any sort of monitors?
So there's different kinds of leak detection systems, and some are as simple as we put this amount in at this end and this amount is coming out at that end, and so somewhere in the middle we have a leak. And then there's more sophisticated kind of leak detection where you actually have fiber optic running along the pipeline that can detect very small leaks. And there's kind of everything in between.
All right. Next topic. Can you just talk about who these rules would actually apply to? So, would these rules apply to intrastate pipelines, just interstate pipelines, existing pipelines, only new ones, all of that?
So the standards that PHMSA sets become the minimum standards. States have to adopt them as their minimum standards for intrastate pipelines. States can choose to adopt stronger standards for their intrastate pipelines if they have the right authority under PHMSA. But they cannot adopt stricter standards for interstate pipelines. With very few exceptions. So these whatever rules PHMSA adopts, those become the base level. There's no place in America that will go below those standards.
All right. Who's actually in charge of enforcing and monitoring compliance with these regulations? Is it PHMSA, the company?
So so PHMSA is in charge of in some inspections and enforcement, and the states can be in charge of some level of inspections and enforcement, and it depends on what we're talking about. But what I don't think a lot of people realize is when we say PHMSA or the state regulator is doing these inspections, they're not actually inspecting the pipeline. They're inspecting the paperwork of the assessments that the operator has done on their pipeline. And so really, often the operator will hire a contractor to do these assessments or inspections, and then PHMSA comes and looks at the paperwork about those assessments and inspections, and that's their inspection. You think that's a fair description, Paul?
yeah, I think people misunderstand. They think that there's going to be guys out in hard hats walking around pipelines looking at stuff, but no, it's people going into the offices. And Bill told the story about during COVID, where the other thing is that PHMSA is generally prohibited from taking documents outside of company offices. So they have to go to a company office and look at the paperwork, but then they have to leave it there. And during COVID, they were holding up paper to the cameras on the Zoom meeting so that PHMSA could read it like that, because they couldn't send it to PHMSA. They wouldn't send it to PHMSA because PHMSA had no right to the paperwork. And why is that? And that's because if PHMSA had that paper, it could be subject to Freedom of Information Act request requirements. In that case, citizens be able to actually see, people be able to see what the company's paperwork says. But because PHMSA's rules require that they leave the paper in the company's offices, it's not controlled by the federal government, and therefore it can't be the subject of a Freedom of Information Act, which keeps citizens and people in the dark about what pipelines are doing to comply with federal pipeline safety law. It's just one of the many ways the Pipeline Safety Act is structured and implemented to prevent citizen participation in regulatory process for pipeline safety.
All right, we've got a number of people asking kind of similar questions here. So one, is there a time frame for these proposed regulations to be implemented? And is it an option to see additional aspects be added into the rules? And on the opposite end of the spectrum, we know that like through the approval process, a lot of times rules tend to get watered down. Is there any sort of part of these rules that you think is like the number one thing that we should be advocating for to make sure actually gets implemented?
You want to take a shot, Bill?
Yes, I think that's it's good to remember that we always at PST we call it bites at the apple. You know, the industry gets lots of bites at the apple through this process. And so we're starting off with our apple here. You know, maybe we wish it was like this, but we got a pretty good NPRM that's close to the kind of apple we wanted, maybe not quite. But we're going to go through this comment period. Once if and when it gets published, there'll be a comment period. We don't have one yet. And that'll be an opportunity for the industry to take a bite out of the apple. It's very hard to add things on to a proposal after it's been proposed. It's very easy to take things out. So we'll have the comment period. We should all be commenting on the things that we want to keep and the things we want to improve. But rest assured, industry will be commenting on all the things that should be taken out. And that's their chance at one bite at the apple. We'll have advisory committee meetings. There's a public comment period around that, both at the meeting itself and written afterwards. That'll be another bite at the apple, and that's historically taken some huge bites out of the apple. And then once there is a final rule, there'll be an opportunity for a petition for reconsideration, all these administrative things. So I think our job as safety advocates is to make sure that as much of that apple remains in place as it can, and we get these in place as quickly as we can so that any pipeline that is built has to follow stronger safety standards.
Mm-hmm. And I would just add that, there's no guarantee that there'll be a public comment period for this rule. The Trump administration has complete discretion in deciding whether it wants to throw this whole thing in the trash can and just ignore this need, or it could take the rule out and modify it somewhat, or it could take the rule just the way it is. But I think, that politicians are beginning to understand how sensitive this issue is, including to people who are conservative and landowners and a fair amount of constituency for the Trump administration. So if you all want to see this rule survive, I think it's going to require a fair amount of public pressure on the Trump administration, the incoming Secretary of Transportation, to say, we're Americans and we need to be protected and we want you to do something like this and you can't just do it. We may also have to have direct pressure on PHMSA administrators when they're appointed. There'll be a variety of individuals appointed to run PHMSA by the Trump administration, and those people need to be targeted. I would say that if people just expect that, I would say the default setting for the Trump administration is to throw this in the can unless there's a lot of public pressure. So I think if you want to see this rule or something come out at all, it's going to require a significant push by everybody on the call and everybody else who's concerned about these pipelines to make it happen. We're going to have to earn something coming out of this process, I'm afraid. I mean, it's possible that the Trump administration could just say, well, let's move this forward because the industry wants certain parts of it. And that could happen, but the downside of that is then the pieces that the industry wants, which are relatively few and far between, but there are things that the industry wants out of this rule. They would get that and they would throw everything else that's good for communities out. For example, I think having first responders all over the country say that they want the first responder, protected, they want information and they want equipment, would be a difficult thing for the Trump administration to ignore. Because, because first responders have a certain, people appreciate them and they have a certain amount of political power that a lot of other folks don't have when it comes to getting resources, materials. I mean, I'm sure they feel they don't get enough, and that's true. But, I think that if they, in particular, advocated for a rule coming out, that might make a difference to the Trump administration. So it's something to think about. But also emergency medical services and hospitals, I think that organizing, near existing pipelines in Texas, for example, there's pipelines in Texas that go right by people's houses, right by hospitals, CO2 pipelines. There's CO2 pipelines that go around completely around a Toyota assembly plant, I believe in Mississippi, could be Alabama, I forget which state. So again, if people around the country who are threatened by these pipelines know they're threatened and talk and push the Trump administration to get a rule out, we're more likely to get something. But if we all just sit on our hands, well, we'll get what people who sit on their hands often get, which is nothing.
All right, we are officially past 9 o'clock. I will leave it up to you, Paul and Bill, if you want to keep going. We still have like 30 questions at least. So your call. We can kind of start wrapping up or go for however long you want. I'll be here till 5 a.m. if you want.
What do you think, Bill? I'm happy to be on for a while longer.
Yeah, I could do maybe another 15, 20 minutes.
Okay, so
All right.
speed questions.
All right, that we can handle. So how about, let's see, is there any language about subsidence, storm surge, flooding, salinity, pH of soil that CO2 pipelines are proposed to be cited in? Anything related to that?
That's what I saw.
All right, lovely. Are there any rules to say?
Although I will say that some of that could be qualified as a geohazard, and so in theory, if soils were highly corrosive for some reason, that might fall within the geohazard requirements that they identify and remediate that.
And
Yes.
another piece is that an area like that could very well be considered a high consequence area because of the ecologically unusually sensitive areas, USAs. And if that were true, then it would be required, it would be part of the integrity management program. Integrity management requires an operator to identify any potential threat to their pipeline and develop a plan to mitigate against it. And so if it were in an HCA, that while there's no maybe specific requirements about it, the operator would be required to identify that threat and mitigate against it.
All right. Are records of inspections and actions available to the public?
Inspections, no, for no good reason. We ask for them a lot. But enforcement actions are on PHMSA's website. They call it the enforcement transparency page, and it's been newly redesigned. It's much easier to use than it was before, but it's still not easy to use. But you can find lots of all the enforcement information on there. And we're always here as a resource to help you all find your way through that. So reach out if we can help.
And hopefully that will remain in place. There's no statutory rule that be provided, and the Trump administration has said that for certain agencies, it's going to cut back their enforcement capacities, and we'll see whether that applies to PHMSA or not. We're not sure about that yet.
Interesting. Are there proposed, let me ask this one first. Is the spike pressure testing done initially only, or is it also done like during operation at any point?
So there's the initial test involves both a spike test and holding the pressure for a long. Spike is just like real fast, bring it up to temperature and bring it down, or bring it up to pressure and bring it down. When you're about to put a pipeline into service for the first time, you have to do that spike, and then you have to also hold it at for 4 hours at a high pressure. The spike hydro test is then also required for a conversion to service. If they're going to take a natural gas pipeline and convert it to CO2 service, they would have to do the spike hydro test, but not that hold. Those are the only times I believe a spike hydro test would be required. Do you know of another time, Paul?
But that's in the proposed rule. In the existing rule, I don't think it's generally required except for in certain unique, I mean, spike, the word spike only appears in the rule once. And, I think they require it for certain kinds of circumstances, but it's used in certain circumstances, but it's not used as a matter of course, I don't think.
In the initial test, when they have to hold for 4 hours, it's the first couple minutes of it, I believe. But yeah, the conversion to service would just be in the proposal.
And what happens if the pipeline operator fails that test?
They have to fix what went wrong and then test it again. And we saw that in the Mountain Valley pipeline. They failed their initial hydro test and replaced the piece that failed and tested it again.
Yeah, and I wrote a report way back in 2010 about substandard steel used for the first Keystone pipeline, and it's quite detailed, and it talks about what happened there was that there were four or five, I think 4 natural gas pipelines that all failed their hydro tests, and the pipes popped open in a number of locations when they pumped them full of water and jacked the pressure up. And they found that not only were a number of pipe segments broken, but a lot of them stretched, which they're not supposed to do too. And so then PHMSA did a big investigation of why that had happened, and found out there was a number of factors. There was a factory or a pipe mill in Mexico that the forklift driver put the wrong kind of steel in the wrong stack, and they used weaker steel for some of the pipelines. And then also there was just simply substandard steel chemistry in some of the pipes. So PHMSA, if there's a hydro test failure, then PHMSA will investigate that and figure out what happened and why, because it may mean that they just one bad segment or a bad weld or something like that, but it could also mean there's systemic problems with the steel alloying and chemistry. So they look at those things pretty closely. I don't think that pipelines test on rupture on hydro tests very often, but that does happen sometimes, and that's why they do them.
So related to the manufacturing of pipe, we've got a question here about, we have heard that Summit has already ordered pipe. If they're storing that pipe outside, how would weather impact the strength of the pipe? I do just want to comment that we heard back from PHMSA today on this, and PHMSA says that Summit has denied that they've purchased any pipe, and that they are looking at doing that in like the 3rd or 4th quarter of 2025, assuming they haven't been stopped by then.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if they had ordered pipe, we'd know it, because they put it out in huge yards that are visible from satellites and from aircraft and people driving by. I mean, Line 3, Embergen line in Minnesota for Line 3 had multiple very large pipe storage yards. And typically, the risk of the pipe isn't necessarily from corrosion because of the steel that's used directly. What the real risk is to the epoxy coating, because epoxy coating is subject to damage by UV radiation. So what you typically see pipeline companies do, they buy new pipe and it's usually either painted green or orangish red. And then if they leave it outside for too long, they're supposed to take house paint, essentially white paint of any sort, and paint it over that epoxy to protect it. And that's why you see the pipe yards turning white over time if they do that. But again, this would be so much pipe if they ordered it all that it would be really obvious that where the pipe yards were. Because they're not going to store it like up in Canada or something like that. It's also really expensive, and unlike the big oil and natural gas companies that self-fund their own pipelines, that self-finance their own pipelines, Summit has to rely on its investors to buy that pipe, and once they buy the pipe, it's sort of a full commitment to moving ahead, and it's quite expensive if the pipeline project then fails. We saw that with the Keystone XL pipeline, where they bought a lot of pipe and ended up ultimately selling it. Probably a lot of it went overseas to other users. But it's, going to cost hundreds of millions, if not $1 billion for the Summit pipeline pipe. So they don't want to make that financial commitment till they know for sure they're going to be able to build. And right now there's enough uncertainty out there in the world that they're not really sure that they're going to build or whether they're going to get permission or not. So we'll see what South Dakota says.
Amazing. All right. So does PHMSA requiring plume modeling for HCAs preclude by preemption the ability of states then to require plume modeling for the entire pipeline, not just HCAs?
We're arguing that no, it doesn't, because the purpose that a state would use plume modeling for is for routing. And again, states have the authority to route. The fact that the federal government may require plume modeling for a different federal purpose doesn't mean that emergency responders can't do their own plume modeling or states can't do their own plume modeling. They have concurrent jurisdiction over emergency response. The local fire department and law enforcement don't wait for the companies to show up and tell them what to do. The Pipeline Safety Act doesn't federalize local emergency responders. They still have the jurisdiction they have under state law. And under that state law, they have the right to, they have the responsibility to assess what the potential risks of a human caused disaster like a pipeline rupture are. And that risk assessment can include dispersion modeling, plume modeling. So yeah, I mean, if the feds want to do dispersion modeling for determining whether an HCA could be affected, they can do that. But that doesn't mean that states can't use the same technical tools to figure out what the route should be. And since, technically, the companies don't have to necessarily even determine the HCAs until later in the process, until after they pick the pipeline route. They don't have any obligations to do anything until after they choose the route, according to what this rule says. The proposed rule recognizes the law as saying, then the pipeline company's dispersion modeling doesn't necessarily even going to be available during the routing process. And we saw that they usually do it ahead of time, like with Summit and Navigator in South Dakota and Iowa and Illinois. They have the dispersion modeling, but they've all said it's secret because they're worried about terrorists. If terrorists get the dispersion modeling, it's going to, create mayhem around the entire country, which of course is, I think we all understand, is ridiculous. But, but the fact that they have their own modeling doesn't mean that a state or county government couldn't do their own modeling. And in fact, we have seen private, modelers do dispersion modeling. I mean, if anybody in this call wanted to get together and collect the money to pay for dispersion modeling for pipelines, we can do that, and there's no rule against it. So, so if we can do it, and the feds can do it, and states can do it, everybody can do it. There's no rule about that. It's just a matter of who pays for it.
All right, I'm going to hit you with some more technical questions in the last few minutes. This one should hopefully be fairly easy to answer. Does the federal code actually have a design feature as a metric when it comes to safety?
Could you repeat that?
Does the federal code actually have like the design features of the pipeline as a metric that's like a requirement, I guess?
Yeah. You want to take that, Bill? I mean,
Yeah, I can start, and if you want to fill it out. So, to start, we talked about this initial hydro test or pressure test that a pipeline has to pass. And so, depending on whatever pressure it's being designed for. And so in order to pass that test, you have to have a certain level of strength to the pipeline. So if it's going to be, if the pipeline's going to operate at, 1400 PSI, engineers will then kind of work backwards from that as to what the pressure test, what that pressure they're going to bring it up to for the pressure test. And that really determines the strength and the thickness of the steel that they're going to use. Then and that's in the code right now. This proposal would also do is it would add some standards as to how to design the system to also prevent fracture propagation, the running ductile fractures, how to design your system so that you know that all the valves and the components are also capable of transporting CO2 as well. Is that a good start there, Paul?
Yeah, I would also say that the way the Pipeline Safety Act technical regulations or the pipeline safety regulation technical regulations work is that that the federal government adopts industry standards by reference. So so 49 in the US or CFR 195.3 relates entirely to what documents are incorporated by reference, partly or wholly in this part. So for the main technical requirements for pipelines are in the are pipeline specifications prepared by the American Petroleum Institute. And so, for example, the steel pipeline is specification 5L for the pipe steel specification 5L, but they have specifications for pumps, they have specifications for meters, they have specifications for valves and everything else that you can imagine. The American Petroleum Institute has specifications and the federal government adopts them all by reference. So the reality is that the detailed specifications for pipelines are contained in private building codes, essentially for the pipeline, and they're incorporated by reference by the federal government. In theory, you can go to the American Petroleum Institute website and see the detailed specifications. They have limited public access. It's last time I went there was a very kludgy way of doing it. If you want to have the actual building code, essentially their API standards for pipelines, you can buy that for, I forget if it's $300 something, something like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, but the detailed specs are not there's very few detailed standards in the federal regulations. Almost all of the detailed building standards, construction standards, and design standards are in the American Petroleum Institute specifications.
All right. Can you talk about just what your sense is of how the proposed rules would determine metal alloys used in CO2 pipelines and valves?
Did you repeat that again? I'm just want to make sure I get it.
What's your sense of how the rules would determine the metal alloys that are used in CO2 pipelines and valves?
The proposed rule talks about that. I don't remember exactly in detail, but the proposed rule would require that, in a very general sense, that the materials in the valves would have to be compatible with carbon dioxide. That's a new piece that doesn't exist right now. Like I said, the American Petroleum Institute has standards for valves, and they probably even have standards for carbon dioxide valves that are used in carbon dioxide service. That doesn't mean that those detailed standards for carbon dioxide pipelines have been formally incorporated into the federal regulations by reference. Often PHMSA is behind the curve significantly in incorporating industry best practices or specifications into the federal regulations. So we'd have to, if I want to answer that question, we'd have to go to the American Petroleum Institute, specifications for valves and see whether they have special rules for carbon dioxide. And then if they do, that they might include not only the steel specifications for the valves, but also any lubrication specifications or any composite materials that are used, or bushings or whatnot. Plus the electrical equipment that's used in them and any control structures and motors and all that stuff. There's a good chance that's all specified. How detailed it is for CO2 versus oil, I don't know. That we'd have to go look at the specs and get into the real nuts and bolts about that.
All right. One more question about API, and then I guess we'll wrap it up with one final question, if that works for you. Do you think, given that there are certainly corrosion risks that come along with CO2, is it even feasible to construct such pipelines with API 5L grade 60 and 65 carbon steel pipelines? Or do you think that the material engineering design should consider alloy corrosion resistant grades to ensure that there are higher safety performances and less risk?
You know, I'm not a pipeline engineer or metallurgist, but I think the answer to that would be, like, for example, the Satartia pipeline, I believe, was X80 API 5L steel. And I mean, I suppose in theory they could take an X65 or X70 steel and make it really thick and maybe comply with the strength requirements for these pipelines, for CO2 pipelines. But then you'd start getting into problems of the pipe steel being quite a bit heavier, and that affects transportation issues and affects material handling and whatnot. So I would guess that the engineers probably typically pick X70 or X80 steel because it's going to be thin enough that it can be light enough that it can be handled. And I just don't know whether I mean, that's a very technical question about, you know, whether a weaker but thicker steel is going to work as opposed to a stronger but thinner steel. And you know, just so you know, last I checked, which is a number of years ago now, for this standard, when you get into pipes over, I believe, like 16 inches, the specifications for the metallurgy and the steel are custom done. The companies are given discretion by the API standards to figure out what their own metal alloying is going to be for the particular pipeline that they're building. And so there's no specific API standard for metallurgy for these pipelines. They just have to meet certain strength requirements and testing requirements. So it gets to a very technical question, and we'd have to ask a pipeline engineer or metallurgist exactly what they think would be possible with weaker steel if it would just simply wouldn't be practical given the limits of steel manufacturing, capabilities and the pressure requirements and the strength requirements. So.
Yeah, and I'll just say, if someone has a really specific question like this, if you go to the contact spot on our website, we do have a senior technical advisor, pipeline engineer on staff. He was the director of accident investigations for rail, pipeline, and hazardous materials for the NTSB for a long time, Rob Hall. And he may be able to answer some of these super technical questions that I certainly can't. So we do get back to those contact us emails promptly. So please feel free to use that.
And here I sat here bragging about how you guys were both the beauty and the brains. What a disappointment.
Falling short.
How about for our last question? What protections are there for those with mobility issues like seniors, disabled people, young children?
In the proposed rule, the pipeline companies would be required, when they do their survey of people who might be exposed within that 2-mile range, they're supposed to take into account individual mobility of particular persons, and which is a pretty good thing to do. At least I think that's in the regulation. It's in the description of what they would would expect them to do. They have to go back and read the regulation and see if it actually gets that level of detail. But PHMSA said that at least they would expect that the companies would have to do that to survey who's there and figure out their mobility, if there's anybody had mobility issues. You know, but again, there's no existing requirement for that whatsoever. Typically the pipeline companies don't provide people a lot of information about the risks they face. They don't help them in evacuation plans. They don't help them with any kind of assistance in terms of mobility issues. They're basically just let people fend for themselves. And remember, the pipeline company staff that come to a rupture are only there to monitor the rupture and to deal with the pipeline itself. Pipeline company employees and contractors have no jurisdiction, no law enforcement authority, no medical services authority or rights, and typically they may be able to, if the law enforcement or medical folks ask them to help and they have training, they might be willing to do it maybe, But I would guess they probably wouldn't, because the company wouldn't want liability for having their people taking that kind of action. But typically, you're not going to have the pipeline company employees or contractors helping, you know, folks in the event of a rupture. It's going to be all up to the local emergency response people. And very often, pipeline company folks don't show up for hours after the rupture anyway, especially in rural areas, remote. You know, their officers are down in what is supposed to be Ames or Des Moines for Summit. You know, if you have a rupture in South Dakota, there may be a South Dakota employee or two, but it might be hours for them to show up. And in a snowstorm, it might be days. So I think that's the answer.
Yeah, yeah, and it's I think it's if we look at the gas side of the regulations, and they have this set formula to determine the potential impact radius of around a pipeline, and if you really get into that formula, it assumes that someone is going to hear the rupture and start running for cover. It does not take into account that someone is not able to run, and they account for a pretty fast speed of running in that formula, and so I don't have a lot of confidence in the regs, even as proposed, in really incorporating those kind of needs into you know, the plume dispersion and identifying the areas at risk.
Yeah, I think one of the things that this didn't do, and it really should have done, the rule should have done, is to require the estimate of the fatality zone. You know, the potential impact radius for gas pipelines, as I understand it, is basically the area in which, you know, everybody would die from the concussive blast or catch on fire. And I'm not, but I know that it's generally not a large enough area that people, even outside the potential impact zones, have certainly died from big pipeline ruptures. You know, but there's no comparable zone estimation for CO2 pipelines. And one of the things we haven't seen any of the modelers do is just to say, for any particular pipeline, what's the area in which it's more likely than not you're going to die, because you won't have there won't be the time. By the time you realize what's happening, the CO2 levels are already too high and you're going to pass out so quickly you won't be able to self-rescue. And I imagine that for some of these big pipelines, it could be, you know, quite a ways away from the rupture, that people would have no chance of surviving it. Certainly if it was, you know, 50 feet or 50 yards or, you know, a few hundred yards from a 24-inch pipeline rupture, there's a good chance that you wouldn't get out alive. I mean, in Satarsha, the closest people are about 0.6 of a mile away, probably. We don't know exactly. And they were passed out within a few minutes. And the only reason they survived is that the emergency responders, their breathing and respiration rates were very low, and the emergency responders just threw them into vehicles and hauled them out and got them to, you know, oxygen tanks. But it seems probable that that they all got brain damage to some degree from having low oxygen levels they were in the plume for 45 minutes. So, but if they had been a quarter mile away, I kind of think, I mean, I don't know, I've seen some of the modeling around that rupture. I think that probably they would have been dead. But exactly what the fatality zone is, the point at which you're more likely than not to die from a rupture, I don't see any group has federal government, you know, industry, you know, or other folks have estimated those distances, that distance for different size pipelines. But it really should be done. You know, I think people need to know if they're within a certain distance of a pipeline, and routing, you know, routing agencies should know they shouldn't put a pipeline within the distance where if it ruptures near those people, they're guaranteed to die.
All right. Way to bring the mood down, Paul. No, I lied though. We do have one last question for you, Paul. The people are clamoring to know, what is your cat's name?
I have 3 cats, and I've had 2 of them on my lap while I've been talking. And they've had Harry, Ani, and Wasi. Harry and Ani, the black cat, she's not black, she's dark gray, has been wondering, her name is Ani, which is short for Anine, which is Anishinaabe for hello, how you doing? Because she's very verbal. So we named her because she loves to talk.
I love it. Amazing. All right. So I know that was a lot of material we just went through. Want to just thank everybody that stuck it out this long. Appreciate your time and everything that you're doing to help in this fight to ensure that the inherent risks of that are associated with carbon pipelines are being mitigated. If we didn't get to your question, feel free to reach out. We are always happy to talk your ear off about this issue. And just want to remind folks too that it's really important for you to reach out to the people that have the power to actually make sure that these rules are enacted. So make sure we're advocating and sending messages, send a letter, an email, a letter to the editor, make a phone call, a telegram, a fax, I don't care, whatever it takes to make sure that the people in power actually move this rule. So just, like we've mentioned earlier, you want to reach out to members of President Trump's administration, the Department of Transportation, the White House, and President Trump himself, as well as the people that kind of have the influence with the administration and the people that can influence or can elevate this issue within the press. Basically, what we're saying is that we need everybody to be talking about this all the time. We want it on everybody's radar. So whatever you can do to make sure that what we all learned tonight and getting it out to everybody else in the world, do it, right? Share it on Facebook, whatever. If you need help figuring out what to say, you want someone to fact check your message, you just want some bulleted talking points, you just want a cheerleader even, don't hesitate to reach out. We will make sure that this is as easy as possible for folks. And with that, I just want to once again thank you both, Bill and Paul, as well as Pipeline Safety Trust and Bold, for sharing their time, their knowledge with us, and certainly encourage folks to get involved with the organizations that sponsored tonight's webinar. They are all excellent sources of information on this issue, so check them out, volunteer, donate, all of the above. And if you've already forgotten who those organizations are, what with all of the other information that we've discussed tonight, just a reminder that it was the Science and Environmental Health Network, the Illinois Coalition to Stop CO2 Pipelines, Dakota Rural Action, Dakota Resource Council, Food and Water Watch, CURE, the Iowa chapter of the Sierra Club, and of course, Bold Alliance. And we are always appreciative of Pipeline Safety Trust and everything they do. So thank you all again for coming. Any last thoughts, Paul or Bill?
This rule's not dead yet, so it'll keep alive if we want it alive. It's a little bit like Tinkerbell. If we all believe it's going to exist, then we just keep clapping and calling for it. And Emma's exactly right. We need to push for this. It's your health and safety on the line. Let's make the effort to keep it going and to pressure the Trump administration to do the right thing here.
Yeah, echo that. Full court press. Thank you everyone who's been on the call tonight for all of the activism and for advocating for your own safety and for your neighbor's safety. Thank you.
All right. Thank you all. We'll talk soon, I'm sure.